Yeah. Just to pick up on Stephen's point from before lunch, I'm not particularly old, but I can't remember any point in time at which I was a normal person and not a complete procurement anorak. So I hope some of the other people in the room are in the same boat. I do find that this issue of socially responsible public procurement is one issue where normal people can kind of meet us halfway and take an interest. So for that reason, I'm quite happy to be speaking about it and to be here in Cardiff with you today. All right, so socially responsible public procurement, will the new directives help? Maybe slightly less exciting than a new dawn, but will they actually help us in any way when we try and do this? What do we mean by socially responsible public procurement? I'm going to touch upon that. Then I'm going to look a little bit about what the social ambitions of the reform were. So a lot of us would have been under the impression that this reform was at least partly about making it easier to do socially responsible public procurement and the various things that we mean when we say that. So I'll look a little bit about what was said in the past, and then the role specifically of the European Parliament and the Court of Justice, which Anne-Marie has already touched upon in terms of promoting these goals. I'll talk a little bit about the specific possibilities that are there in the now final text of the directives that we have. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I believe Simon is going to touch on those as well in his presentation. But I will try and give a few examples of national policies which I think we can maybe have a discussion as to whether they fit within the new possibilities or not. I'm going to just briefly try and invite a critique of those, again, looking back at some of the issues Stephen raised in his presentation about whether or not these types of provisions are effective, are they good value for money, how do we manage them, how do we monitor them, that type of thing. And I guess we're going to leave questions and discussions to the end. Okay, so what is socially responsible public procurement? This is just a definition I drew up myself, so you could argue with it, I suppose, but I think this emphasis on looking at the entire life cycle is one that comes through very strongly in the new directives, and it applies both in the environmental and the social fields. So we're not just looking at the social impacts for the end users, which things like employment or accessibility for disabled people for service, those would all be end user impacts. We're also able to look at impacts that go down the supply chain. And as Anne-Marie mentioned, there is a limitation upon this in procurement law, which relates to the link to the subject matter of the contract. So if you're buying a service, you shouldn't be able to tell your supplier that actually we also want you to invest in this completely separate program that has nothing to do with our contract. That would very obviously be not linked to the subject matter of the contract. But there's a lot more grey areas that come up when we start to apply that test. So in terms of supply chain impacts, we already talked a little bit about fair trade. End-of-life impacts, I think, is an interesting one. For those of you who've had to deal with TUPE, to deal with protection of employees, this often comes up at the end of contracts. Do you have the information you need to make available to tenderers about which employees are going to be transferred, the conditions under which they're working? So when we think about the social impacts of procurement, I think there really is a need to look at the entire life cycle of what we're purchasing, be that a good service or indeed a work. When we talk about socially responsible procurement, does it include things like access for SMEs or local businesses, as we tend to actually think of SMEs? I don't know. There is a sort of blurred line. Some people would say support for SMEs is really an economic policy, often part of regional economic policy to make sure that we have a healthy levels of competition and new businesses able to start up. So I am going to talk a little bit about the provisions that relate to SMEs in the new directives, but I think it is arguable, is that part of the social pillar? Is it economic? Similarly, there are environmental issues which we might think of also have an immediate impact on people. So if you're looking at levels of emissions, it's not just about climate change, it's also about local health impacts, those type of things. So just to be aware of the complexity there. I think another sort of key question in this whole area is, are we looking at enforcing minimum standards, or are we talking about adding social value? So in procurement in general, if something is written into a law, unless that law contravenes European law, you're going to be able to include it in your contract. So there's no question about really including those minimum standards that we have set out in our national laws. And indeed, that's protected explicitly under the new directives under Article 18.2. But if we start to move into the field of adding value, so how do we actually leverage procurement in order to achieve social objectives, it gets more complex and it gets a little bit more legally fraught as well, in my view. Okay, so what was the ambition using some form social condition or social criteria in their tenders. So not a negligible amount. Interestingly, if you do read any of these studies, there's a lot of sort of unexpected findings. So for example, the countries that were at the top of this league were Norway, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. France was actually down at the bottom of the league when it came to including social requirements in their tenders. And when you look at the other studies that were done in terms of level of cross-border procurement, you don't always find the expected findings either. So people in the UK sometimes say that, oh, we award a lot more contracts to overseas bidders or bidders from other member states, whereas the Germans and the French tend to keep their contracts for themselves. That was not borne out in these studies. It showed that actually UK businesses are very good at winning contracts overseas. We do not award a disproportionate number of contracts to overseas bidders in the UK, unlike smaller countries such as Ireland, which actually do award a lot of contracts to overseas bidders for understandable reasons. We do have some guidance under the existing directives called Buying Social. I don't know if anyone's come across this. My view of it is that it's not overly helpful, at least from a contracting authority perspective. It spends a lot more time telling you what you can't do as opposed to what you can do. So hopefully we will be getting some more comprehensive and perhaps more helpful guidance coming out once these directives have been adopted. Underlying sort of these social ambitions, obviously there's an ongoing concern coming from the European Commission and from other quarters as well about what they call disguised restrictions on trade. So when we talk about achieving social objectives, do we really mean that we just want to keep our contracts for local businesses and that we don't want to accept tenders from other member states? So that is an underlying tension here. On the other hand, there was a very strong lobby during the revision process from both NGOs and from unions who said, look, the time has come to incorporate this into our procurement law. And I think that voice was heard to a large extent. Okay, so in terms of social criteria, there is this question, okay, what can you ask for and at what stage in the procurement process? And I'm going to show you a diagram later on of what I think the position is under the new directives, but obviously there's room to argue over or discuss that. But there is a concern about doing things at selection stage, as Anne-Marie mentioned. That is seen as having quite a large potential to preclude competition. So if you say to someone, you can't actually even compete for this contract because you don't have the following social credentials, that is seen as being quite restrictive of trade, and therefore there is quite a precautionary approach taken to it. That said, there are opportunities under the new directives to look at certain criteria at selection stage, which would specifically target defaults, for example, tax compliance. Most of us in Europe live in what used to be called social welfare states, and even though tax compliance may not be the sexiest aspect of social criteria, it is something that is quite important if we plan to maintain a social welfare state. So I'll look a little bit about what those provisions allow you to do. References to labels, this becomes more important as we start to look at supply chain criteria, because how do we actually verify what a company in China is doing? Obviously, most contracting authorities do not have the capacity to go and verify or audit what's taking place throughout their supply chains. So third-party labels, which are issued not by companies themselves, but by independent organizations, are seen as having quite a large role to play in this field. It's not just labels that are actually put on a product themselves, but also things like SEDEX or SA8000, these other external verification schemes that get used. And there was a lot of debate about, how do you define those labels, how do you make sure that they're not abused, and what can you actually do with them within the procurement process. Measures to promote SME participation. Again, there was a lot of discussion about that in terms of lots, maximum turnover limits. At one point, it was proposed that there would be a mandatory division of contracts into lots. That is no longer part of the directives. It is up to contracting authorities, but they do have to justify it if they decide not to just divide a contract into lots. An issue that was of particular importance to the Cabinet Office, at least in the UK, was this issue of employee-owned mutual companies, sometimes also known as social enterprises. So these are companies where essentially they've most often been spun off from public sector employment, and they're now trading in their own right. And the question is, can you award contracts to them? In terms of award criteria, the whole issue of lowest price versus meat, and then the scope of the concessions directive. And we now have water being excluded completely from the concessions directive. And this is due, by the way, to a European citizens initiative that took place, where they got over 1 million signatures from people who are concerned about the privatisation of water supply. And this resulted in the exclusion of water from the new concessions directive. Okay, I'm just going to go over this quickly because I am a bit short on time. But in terms of the European Parliament, we had quite an active rapporteur, a man called Mark Tarabella, who's from Belgium. He tabled 253 amendments to the draft directives. Many of these did relate to the social and environmental side, as Anne-Marie mentioned. In particular, there was this issue of can we abolish lowest price as an award criterion? That was part of the ambition from his perspective. It didn't happen. By the way, it may look like it happened if you take a cursory look at the directives, but you can still award contracts on lowest price. It's just called meat, which is a little bit confusing, but that's the compromise they arrived at. Member states also obviously had specific social provisions they wanted, such as the UK on the role of employee-led mutuals. And then, as Anne-Marie mentioned, there was this important case, the Dutch coffee case, which very much pushed forward, I think, the position of social criteria, certainly at the award stage. On abnormally low tenders, which again have some relation to social criteria, there was also an important case, the Slovensko case, which the judgment was given during the revision process. Okay, so this is my attempt to summarize the different provisions. And again, as I said, Simon's going to go into more detail on these, so I won't run through them all. The numbers in brackets are references to the article numbers in the public sector directive. But it is worth noting that the utilities directive has many of the same possibilities, if not all. And even in the concessions directive, you have some of these articles exist as well. So as you can see, in my view anyways, there are opportunities at every stage to implement social criteria. It starts out when you're looking at your definition of your contract. We now have a lighter regime for social and other specific services. So this includes contracts related to healthcare, education, other areas. You have higher threshold and a lighter set of rules. So you have more freedom in terms of how you award them. As Anne-Marie mentioned, we've got a provision for reservation to workshops, which are employing the disabled and now disadvantaged workers as well. Division into lots. At exclusion and selection stage, you do have quite a range of provisions that are there, both in terms of mandatory exclusion for things like child labour and human trafficking, and then in terms of tax and social security payments, you have both a mandatory and a discretionary exclusion. And then you also have, annexed to the directive, the ILO core conventions are referenced, and these are conventions that relate to things like forced labour, the ability to engage in collective bargaining, etc. And you are able to exclude operators at selection stage as a discretionary grounds. The other ones in terms of awards, again, I think Simon's going to look at them in a bit more detail. You can take into account trading conditions, accessibility for persons with disabilities, which was there previously. The provision on abnormally low tenders, we had some discussion on this this morning. And unfortunately, we do not have a definition of abnormally low tenders. So that makes it a little bit difficult to say, here's a strong provision which allows us to get rid of bidders, for example, who may be underpaying their employees. It's not that clear cut, but there is some potential there. And indeed, obligations, where you do perceive something to be an abnormally low tender. Finally, the contract performance conditions. We do have specific ones relating to subcontracting, which can be quite important in terms of tracing social criteria throughout your supply chain. And also, as Anne-Marie discussed, these other conditions, but they do now need to be linked to the subject matter of the contract, so a little bit less room to manoeuvre there, perhaps. Okay. Just my view of this is, if you're to break it down, is that you really have three possible approaches when you want to address social matters in your procurement. The first is to look at who. So you can either reserve contracts for certain enterprises if they meet the conditions, or you can look at your exclusion and selection criteria to try and make sure that the companies who you're inviting to bid meet certain minimum standards in terms of tax compliance and other social criteria. Then you've got the what stage, which is really the meat of your procurement, where you're looking at both your specification and then your award criteria and how those can be designed to take social characteristics into account. And this is where the whole life cycle approach comes into question, and also the question of life cycle or whole life costing which can be quite important in terms of giving weight to criteria other than initial purchase price. And then finally, you've got the how. So how are they going to deliver the contract? Are they going to be setting up apprenticeships if it's a works contract? How are they going to be dealing with their employees? All of these other social issues that come up. And those are being dealt with in your contract performance clauses. Just a few examples of national policies. So in Belgium, dating back at least to the Beaches case, which I believe was a Belgian case, you have a lot of initiatives to help long-term unemployed via public contracts. I believe those will continue. In Germany, as far as I'm aware, a lot of contracting authorities are really looking at these supply chain issues. So they are really interested in what's happening in the factories in Bangladesh and China and attempting to come up with objective and transparent ways to trace their supply chain. In the UK, I thought it was interesting that we sometimes think of, oh, this as being sort of a modern movement to introduce other extraneous factors into procurement. It's not at all. It's been going on for as long as we've had government procurement. It's only in more recent years that we've really restricted it due to our desire to foster cross-border trade. So going back to 1891 in the UK and probably earlier, we had a parliamentary resolution to ensure fair wages paid to workers on government contracts. More modern iterations of this would be your fair trade towns, and also in London we have the London Living Wage, which has been quite successful locally in terms of promoting higher standards. Of course, we also now have the Social Value Act from 2012 and policy on tax compliance and procurement, which is being implemented at the moment. Again, just looking internationally, we discussed already this morning this whole issue of set-asides, which are quite prevalent in the US and other countries. In Korea, they also have set-asides for war veterans. I've met some Koreans recently, and they're telling me about this policy. And in Canada, I think we have some Canadians here, perhaps, they have preferences for Aboriginal-owned enterprises as well. So this is an international phenomenon that we use these things in our procurement. Just very briefly, and maybe we can pick up on this in the discussion, are these provisions effective? Do they promote unfair competition? Are they bad procurement because they're distracting us from what we need to focus on in terms of value for money? Do they create dependencies in the enterprises who are benefiting from them and who are then in a difficult position if these programs are suddenly stopped? These are all questions I think we should think about and reach our own conclusions, and I invite any discussion on that.
Thank you.